Hey folks, you're very welcome back for what is episode 2 of the Meditations on Movement podcast. This episode, I'm trying out something a little bit different. I am actually recording this. I have a camera out in front of me, but it's still going to be a podcast. I'm not really going to release the full video. The reason why I'm recording is so that I have some video footage to go along with maybe some snippets that I'm going to put up on social media, as I explained in the last episode. I want to obviously make sure that what comes across in the podcast, I have time to sort of expand on points. And I was kind of explaining the way social media can be quite limiting in terms of the ability to expand, and it has to be curated for that format specifically, or that channel, that platform. So hopefully this doesn't change things too much. Hopefully it's still a very intimate experience in terms of it being a podcast. I know in the past, whenever I looked at a camera, it's been actually quite a challenging thing to get myself centered. But I suppose previously it's always been, maybe a script in mind of something that I want to explore. And considering this is a lot more open, hopefully that doesn't come across. I haven't got a title for this episode yet, but I know what I'm going to explore. We're going to be looking at a few things on, say, like frustration in training and like patience and stuff like that. So you've probably seen the title already, and you have a title in front of you, but I don't have a title just yet. So let's kind of go with things. The way in which I'm going to do a lot of the first episodes is I'm kind of going back on what were some of the few emails that I sent out as part of the actual Meditations on Movement emails when I first came across here to Vienna late last year. And this is pretty much the very first email that I sent out. This one commenting on something that myself, that I kind of went through within the first sort of week or two of the school. So to kind of set the tone here, the idea was that when we first got into the movement school, obviously the way to think of it is it's a lot of new movements. And with a lot of new movements and kind of new styles, new ways of training, just everything being sort of brand new. Obviously I had trained my body and kind of physically prepared in different ways. But all this exposure to new movement, like we've all gone through where we expose ourselves to new movements, there's a lot of soreness that goes along with it. If you've ever tried just something random, you'll suddenly go like, oh yeah, like I've done squats before, but maybe you haven't done, an AMRAP set of squats where you just do as many reps as possible. You've just been doing barbell squats, and suddenly that leaves your legs feeling just really, really sore. You get that delayed onset muscle soreness the next day. So that was kind of what happened within the first week of the school, and it was to be expected. It was just a lot of new things, and one of the things that we sort of went into a lot was the spine. We sort of explored different movements of the spine. Typically I would have had this sort of training process of training kind of like core stability or bracing the core, which is obviously very relevant in its own right. But the stuff that we were doing with the spine was more kind of like the segmental movement, seeing the kind of movements from extension to flexion, but more kind of each individual segment as opposed to, say, the spine moving as one unit. And obviously I've done that stuff before, but just not in such a high volume within the first few weeks. So that was the one thing I noticed certainly within the first while of training, was how much soreness that I was getting just in weird areas, like, as I said, my spine. And it's not that it was a bad thing, it was just suddenly I was very aware of how stiff and rigid my spine was, and how when coming under load, under segmentation, flexion, extension, all of these different things, it needed a little bit more time. So on top of that, then we also did a lot of work on, say, like acrobatics and handstands. That was one of the first things that we did when we kind of first got in. And it was very interesting. It once again, it exposed you to new things, and there's a lot of insight to be taken from a lot of that. So after the first week, we'd done a lot of the practices together as a school, and we'd gone through, and Marcello had given us loads of different things to try out, things to work on, obviously, in the sessions. And myself and Adam ended up doing a session outside of the actual school itself, and we obviously wanted to kind of put together a session based on some of the stuff that we'd seen during the week. And obviously, as I said, there was a lot of soreness that had kind of built up across the week from kind of Monday to Thursday, and this session was on Friday. So maybe I should have been a little bit more, maybe I should have expected less of myself, considering how beat up the body was going into this session. But we went in and we started doing some handstands, and it was so interesting considering, like, handstands aren't even my forte right now. I mean, When I think about it, I've kind of made a running joke the whole year that my path to enlightenment is going to be through handstands, because I hate them. I have a very passionate hatred for handstands. I don't know why. I can't understand like what part of me really hates them, but for whatever reason, obviously maybe it's just the lack of progress that I make with them in a space of time. The position itself, like I've always felt as if handstands in some sense were very flashy and not really didn't really have much correlation over to training. Like I'll say that outright. That's the way I used to think. But considering a lot of acrobatics, you are spending a lot of time on your hands, so it kind of makes sense that you should have an ability to kind of correct in the air more through the body rather than, say, adjusting the position. You know, obviously acrobatics, there's an element of, you know, you're moving within an overhead position with your hands. So, you know, sometimes maybe there's not as much of a correction needed from the body. It's just general momentum that sort of gets you to the next position. But as you obviously start to delve deeper into these sort of things, you start to realize, okay, where are you lacking? And I've noticed that certainly in a lot of my acrobatics in terms of the progressions is if I try to slow myself down in the middle of an acrobatic or maneuver like a cartwheel or whatever it is, it's hard to actually adjust my body because I just don't have as much awareness as, say, someone who has lots and lots of years of practice with handstands, with acrobatics and those kind of things. So these are the things that you learn in time. So I was noticing that with handstands very much, obviously, when I had first started with them. And as I said, like vehement hatred of them. So I kind of was pushing myself to the idea of, okay, we've got to work on handstands. Like other people within the class were getting quite good at them, or at least, you know, they had done them previously themselves. So I could see the areas in which I was lacking that I needed to progress in. So we did some handstands in that session, and one thing that I remember more specifically at the start was I just had no connection, like no awareness at all. Like there'd be corrections given of, you know, try to correct from the hands, try to correct from the shoulders, and I literally just had no body awareness there. And obviously now it's starting to build, get better, even though the handstand duration that I'm holding for isn't anything impressive. I'm still getting that every now and then where I get that connection, I get that sort of feeling of being kind of central throughout the entire body, and that feeling is obviously good. It's a measurement of progress that I kind of use in some sense. All right, but back then I was just getting like very, very frustrated because I was being told a lot of these different things that I needed to work on, or needed to be aware of during the handstand that I just wasn't getting. So we were hammering away with handstands, and I was just thinking, okay, I just need to get more reps in. And this sort of brings me on to something that we're going to discuss in a second, which is kind of like the real benefits of training and the effect of training and all that sort of stuff. But I just saw myself getting frustrated. And because obviously everything, like I had the entire year ahead of me and I was just getting frustrated within that moment, it kind of led me to almost like just get entirely frustrated with that session itself, you know, that Friday session after sort of a busy week of training. And it's only when you get a chance to sort of like zoom out, you know, later on in the week, then, next week, not later on in that week, but the next week, suddenly I made a little bit of progress in handstands. And it was just so funny because you're looking at the individual moment, like that individual session that I had on the Friday where you go, okay, I was just outright frustrated. Like I just remember doing rep after rep, trying to get into this position and, you know, even being externally aggravated. Like Adam, I'm sure during the session was like, you're not fun to be around when during that session because you're just so in the zone and you're like, there's just rage coming out of like every pore of your being. So that's obviously not something that is conducive to a good training environment, you know, acting that way or being frustrated in some sense. You know, frustration doesn't have to be entirely negative, but you can understand in that sense that I was letting the frustration get the better of me and it didn't suit me, it didn't help me in that situation. It just kind of, you know, it led to sort of a cloud of frustration, not only for that session, but for, you know, almost a bit of time after that. So it's always funny then viewing it, I suppose, you know, having the ability to have a bit of hindsight with it, but also then in terms of like next week, then seeing the progress that have been made, it's just like, oh, you're just being impatient, you know, you're not really giving yourself the opportunity to see progress in your training when you're frustrated like that. Like certainly I get that, you know, we need to see progress in our training, and sometimes that frustration can be because we're not noticing progress, but it kind of leads to the question of, you know, how do we actually see the progress, or how do we measure progress? What is progress within training? I think that's the way in which I wanted to go with this. So when we think of progress, one thing that we have to look at is, where does the progress actually come from? And when we train, when we do things in that repeated nature, whether it be strength training, would be a sport, would it be kind of the things that I'm doing in terms of like the acrobatics, like a really new thing. The way to think of it is, doing the reps, okay, is obviously really important. Getting those reps in, and causing a stimulus, so that the body is forced to adapt. It doesn't necessarily mean that like the stimulus itself is making the progress. The progress comes from the recovery. So your brain and nervous system takes that stimulus and does something with it. Okay. Obviously, then the sort of like the, how would you call it? The strength of the stimulus is one way to think of it. So, if you do 5 reps of something, it's not really that strong of a stimulus. There's not really much for your body to go by. But if you do, hundreds of reps, obviously within your capacity and capability, obviously you have to be strong enough for 100 reps of something not to break you. If it's your first time doing something, it's probably not the most advisable thing. But obviously you can consider that, say that's a stronger stimulus. But it also needs to be a relevant stimulus. So for someone who it's their first time doing something, 5 reps might actually be a lot. But for someone who maybe has a little bit of experience with something, 5 reps isn't going to do much. They need to go up to that, 20 reps, 40 reps, up to 100, loads and loads of reps for them to see any sort of change. That stimulus needs to be strong enough, okay? So when your body sort of takes in the strength of the stimulus, that's where it goes about the adaptation process even. So it sees that stimulus as significant enough that it needs to change something. It needs to adapt to it. It needs to get better. So that's where we really see the progress. So for me, in that moment in time, when I think back to it, I had just done a hard week of training. As I said, I was super sore, lots of new different things, and my body was just taking in all of this new stimulus. Like there's just so much of it, and that's good. That kind of promotes a positive change in the body. So as I was sleeping, as I was recovering, that's where my brain was going through the pattern, the things, the stimulus that it was taking in, all these bits of feedback, both internal and external, and it was taking those in, it was digesting them, and it was doing something with them. It was relaying or laying new patterns within the brain, so that when it goes to do it the next time, it's better equipped, it's better able to solve the problem. So I had accumulated so much stress within the week up until that Friday point that obviously like it just didn't have much resources to dedicate towards the session itself. So it was good that I got the reps in, but I should have been a little bit more, I should have been a little bit easier on myself, considering all of the stuff that had just been done previously, a lot of new stuff. That the Friday session was obviously going to be not useless, but I was going to be less able in some sense. And that showed then in the next week, as I said. So that showed by the fact that I was suddenly able to see a little bit more progress in the position, awareness of the hands, awareness of the shoulders. All of those different things are ways in which my body was sort of like progressing. So, still hadn't seen like a massive jump in, say, the duration of the handstand, but suddenly being able to feel, okay, I can actually kind of connect to the ground a little bit more with my hand. I'm connecting to the shoulders in a lot better way. So that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind when it comes to, say, the progress, how it's measured, and how you sort of see it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like numbers. It doesn't necessarily have to be like reps. All those things, obviously, they're important ways in which we kind of measure some movements. But sometimes even an increased level of awareness can be a really, really good indicator of progress, and it certainly was for me there in that sort of instance. So what's sort of the key thing then, as I've sort of said there, that idea of progress and where it's made. If I think back to the situation, then obviously it's the ability to be able to look back and evaluate and review, but patience really is an important thing, especially in that situation that I was in. So having the ability to just look at it and just go, okay, like frustration is rising. I'm getting frustrated by the fact that I can't complete the reps, but does it serve me to to let that anger, to let that frustration come out in that session itself? it didn't really do much for me. It just kind of, made the session itself stale, and I should have been more aware of the fact that, the progress is going to come with time. So although the reps now might not be amazing and fantastic, the more important thing is that I just continue to move, that I continue to add to the stimulus that I was already adding, all of that different all of the different sessions and stuff like that. I should have just been a little bit more aware of that at the time. So I suppose that's the thing that I'm trying to communicate then in terms of this episode of the podcast, is just being a little bit more patient with yourself. Are you getting frustrated by sort of what you're seeing as like a lack of progress? You've set your expectations too high within, say, like a training week, a training month, whatever it is, or even within a year. Sometimes we just get frustrated to the point that we might give up on something, even though we've been making progress. Even though we've kind of given our body everything that it needs to make progress, we've done the reps, we've got everything in, we've pushed ourselves hard. But how are we sort of measuring that progress? Are we expecting ourselves to go from, like in my case, expecting to go from a complete lack of ability to do a handstand to suddenly getting a 10-second handstand within 1 week? I think that's unrealistic to some degree. So that's sort of an important thing to keep in mind, is where are you setting your expectations? Although it's important to kind of set goals, if you set yourself those unrealistic expectations, you're kind of setting yourself up to be frustrated, to be upset with yourself, even though you've probably made progress. And if you've made progress, that's the important thing. It's certainly you've done something right, in the sense that you've made progress, and then you kind of have to look upon yourself and go, okay, well, I've made progress. Have I been actually too unrealistic, or have I just not pushed myself enough in some regard? Like if you've only dedicated, say, like 10 minutes of a session once a week to something, and then suddenly you're like, well, I've made a small bit of progress, why haven't I made more? Well, maybe you just need to increase the duration, increase the reps, whatever it may be. Obviously it's very specific to the circumstance, but the important thing is you've made progress. So try not to obviously let your expectations kind of like spoil your experience, and limit your progress when you've made progress. Okay, so an important thing to certainly take into account. It's certainly a lesson that I learned from that session itself. If this has led to any sort of like questions or anything like that, I'd certainly or opinions. Obviously, if you've gone through something very similar with a training session, even things outside of training, obviously just letting your expectations get the better of you, or letting frustration get the better of you. I'd love to hear back from you. I heard a few people got in touch with me after the first episode of the podcast, which was great. I really love that idea of just communicating with people in a real way. Like sometimes, once again, it's something that I'm not going to try and do too much, but like this idea of like bashing social media too much. Like sometimes I think maybe social media doesn't foster great in-depth levels of communication. Sometimes messages, even text messaging on its own can be very short, blunt, and sometimes you don't get the ability to communicate as well or as in-depth as you would like to. So I obviously send this out with an email, so respond to the email. If you have a listen to this and then it kind of sparks something in your mind, brings up some questions, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts, let me know your opinions. One thing I'd also ask as well, considering obviously this is a private podcast, so I'm only sending it to you guys who are subscribed to the email list. I'm putting out some snippets on my social media to sort of promote it and get more people to listen in. Be sure to send this to someone if you think that they would find it valuable. If something comes up that sort of makes you think of a friend, someone you know, certainly send it to them. I'd love to hear why, or maybe send it to them as well, obviously. But I think that's everything we're going to go through for today. I'm sure certainly as time goes on, we'll get a sort of good bit of feedback in terms of how long these episodes should be, and then obviously what we discuss in them. But I think, as I said, we're probably going to go through a lot of the emails that I would have sent out when I first started the Meditations on Movement email series, because there's obviously a lot of things in there that I explored in a little bit of detail, but obviously email formats doesn't allow you to maybe expand as much as I've expanded here. So certainly if you have any ideas for future episodes, be sure to let me know. But I think for the moment, folks, I'm going to leave it at that. So that was episode 2 of the Meditations on Movement podcast. And I'll talk to you soon. All right, folks?